The Tower of London is remembered today as a landmark of English history, its white stone walls rising proudly above the Thames, a symbol of monarchy, power, and heritage. Tourists walk its courtyards, marvel at the crown jewels, and hear tales of kings and queens who once strode through its gates. Yet for most of its history, the tower was not a place of awe, but of dread. Behind its walls, it was less a palace than a fortress of fear, a structure deliberately built to intimidate, to project domination, and to serve as a warning that the king's power was absolute and inescapable. From its beginnings, the tower's purpose was control. Built by William the Conqueror in the late 11th century, it was designed not only as a defensive stronghold, but as a visible statement of Norman authority over a conquered land. Its massive stone keep, the White Tower, loomed over London like a fist clenched in stone, a reminder to the English that resistance was futile. Every time its silhouette rose against the skyline, it told the city the king is watching and the king is in command. It was not just architecture, it was intimidation in physical form. For centuries, the tower functioned in this dual role, both a royal residence and a fortress meant to cow the population. It held weapons, garrisons, and provisions, making it not only defensible, but a place from which royal force could be projected. Its very presence in the heart of London was a constant reminder that the monarchy stood above the people. In times of rebellion or unrest, the tower became a refuge for kings, but also a prison for those who dared to challenge them. Its walls echoed with authority, but also with the whispers of fear. The tower's reputation grew darker as stories spread of what happened inside. Though kings and queens occasionally stayed within its walls, the tower became associated more with chains and dungeons than with thrones and crowns. Ordinary Londoners came to see it less as a palace of majesty and more as a symbol of repression. The sight of prisoners being marched through its gates, their fates uncertain, deepened its aura of dread. The fortress was no longer just a military structure. It was a theater of power where loyalty was rewarded with safety and defiance punished with imprisonment or death. This transformation was not accidental. Monarchs understood the power of fear as a tool of governance. By turning the tower into both a royal treasury and a prison for high-profile captives, they ensured that it carried symbolic weight to be sent. There was not merely to be confined. It was to be publicly branded as an enemy of the crown. Its towering walls and looming battlements reinforced that message, casting a literal shadow over London, as though reminding the city of the monarchy's ever-present gaze. The fear associated with the tower was magnified by its secrecy. The public rarely knew what happened behind its gates. Rumors swirled of torture chambers, secret executions, and ghosts of the condemned wandering its corridors. Whether all these stories were true mattered less than the fact that they were believed. The tower became not just a building but a legend, its myths amplifying its reality, making it a symbol of terror as much as stone. Even when not actively used for executions or imprisonment, the tower served its purpose as a deterrent. Rebellions faltered at the thought of being crushed within its walls. Nobles plotted carefully, knowing that if they failed, their fate would almost certainly lead them through Traitor's Gate. The fortress loomed as both a threat and a promise that the king's enemies would not simply be defeated, but humiliated and destroyed under the watchful eyes of London. Today, the tower is polished by tourism, its legends softened into stories for curious visitors. But to the people of medieval and early modern England, it was not an attraction. It was a menace. Its towers and battlements did not inspire pride so much as fear, a constant reminder that the crown's justice was merciless and its reach unavoidable. The tower was never just a seat of majesty. For centuries, It was a fortress of fear, designed to make the very thought of rebellion unthinkable. The Tower of London is often remembered as a royal fortress and treasury, but for much of its history it was above all a prison, a place where the condemned awaited their fate. Within its thick stone walls, nobles, rebels, and traitors were confined, sometimes for months or years, sometimes for only a few days before their execution. To be taken through Traitor's Gate by boat from the Thames was to be marked. Few who entered left with their lives intact. The Tower's reputation as a prison was not just about confinement, it was about inevitability. Once inside, the condemned knew that the Tower was the final stop on the road to death. The Tower's role as a prison began in the Middle Ages and grew with each century. Unlike ordinary jails that held common criminals, the Tower was reserved for prisoners of high status or high threat. Kings and queens used it to contain nobles who posed political dangers, foreign captives taken in war, or clergy who defied the crown. This made imprisonment there not only a punishment but a performance of power. By locking away prominent figures, the monarchy showed that no rank was beyond its reach. Life inside the Tower varied depending on one's station and fortune. Some prisoners, like high-born nobles, were allowed a degree of comfort, furnished chambers, servants, and even access to gardens within the fortress. But this relative privilege did not change the grim reality that they were cut off from freedom, living under constant guard with the shadow of execution hanging over them. Others, less fortunate, languished in dank, airless cells, chained to walls, fed on scraps, and left to rot. The same walls that protected the monarchy became cages for those who opposed it. The Tower's reputation grew darker because so many who entered its gates never returned. Rebels against the crown, whether peasants' leaders, rival claimants, or disgraced nobles, were paraded into its dungeons and out again to the scaffold. The very geography of the Tower reinforced this journey. The river carried the accused through Traitor's Gate, where they were delivered into the fortress, and from there to the execution ground at Tower Hill, or for the most infamous, to a private beheading within the Tower itself. It was a grim choreography, a ritual of state power in which the Tower served as both stage and prison. The condemned who lived there left their marks, both literal and figurative. In the Beauchamp Tower, prisoners carved inscriptions and symbols into the walls, desperate to leave some trace of their existence. These graffiti, still visible today, testify to the fear, hope, and defiance of those who awaited their fate. Each carving is a silent cry across centuries, a reminder that behind the Tower's legends were real men and women, stripped of freedom, staring at stone walls while time ran out. Among the most famous prisoners were high-born victims of political upheaval. Anne Boleyn, the second wife of Henry VIII, was confined there before her execution in 1536. Lady Jane Grey, proclaimed queen for 9 days, awaited her death in its chambers. Elizabeth I, before ascending the throne, was imprisoned by her sister Mary, uncertain whether she would leave alive. Their stories illustrate how the Tower served as the ultimate weapon of royal power, not just confining enemies, but holding even the highest in suspense between life and death. But the Tower did not only hold royalty and nobles, rebels from uprisings, including leaders of the Peasants' Revolt, were also confined within its walls. Some were executed swiftly, others tortured, all serving as examples of what happened to those who dared challenge authority. Foreign captives, too, were imprisoned in its chambers, trophies of war locked away in the heart of England's greatest fortress. In every case, the Tower's function was the same: to remind the world that the crown could capture and crush its enemies. The symbolism of the Tower as a prison endures. For centuries, its name struck fear precisely because imprisonment there rarely ended with freedom. To be sent to the Tower was to be branded as condemned. Whether held in relative comfort or in chains, the outcome was the same: isolation, despair, and the looming scaffold. The tower was not simply a place of confinement. It was a waiting room for death, a prison where the condemned could hear the footsteps of their executioners long before the blade fell. Beneath the proud battlements of the Tower of London lay a darker truth: chambers where cruelty was engineered with precision. Though the tower is remembered today as a fortress of kings and a keeper of treasures, it was also one of England's most infamous torture sites. Within its thick walls, prisoners were subjected to devices designed not for quick punishment, but for prolonged agony, tools of fear that broke bodies and crushed spirits, leaving the tower etched forever in the imagination as a place of torment. The rack was perhaps the most feared of these instruments, a simple wooden frame with rollers at each end. It worked by binding a prisoner's hands and feet, then slowly turning the rollers to stretch the body. Ligaments tore, joints dislocated, and muscles ripped apart as the body was pulled beyond its natural limits. The rack was not always used to kill, but to extract confessions. The screams of victims echoed through the tower's dungeons, a warning to all who heard them that defying the crown carried unimaginable costs. The rack's very presence was enough to force many prisoners into submission before the torture even began. Another notorious device used within the tower was the scavenger's daughter, a cruel counterpart to the rack. Where the rack stretched the body, the scavenger's daughter crushed it. Prisoners were forced into a crouched position, with iron bands compressing their limbs and chest until circulation failed and pain became unbearable. Blood rushed to the head, veins bulged, and some victims fainted or bled from the nose and ears. It was a device that embodied suffocation and pressure, turning the body in on itself in a grotesque parody of confinement. The manacles were also infamous in the tower. Prisoners were suspended by their wrists, their bodies dangling helplessly in midair for hours or days. The weight of their own bodies tore at shoulders and arms, causing excruciating pain and long-term damage. This method required no elaborate machinery, only iron cuffs and hooks set into the cold stone walls. The simplicity of the manacles made them particularly cruel, a reminder that suffering could be inflicted with nothing more than restraint and time. These chambers of torture were not merely places of punishment, they were instruments of power. The goal was rarely truth, but compliance. Confessions extracted under agony gave trials the appearance of legitimacy, even when they were little more than performances. Torture silenced dissent, spread fear, and reminded every prisoner that the tower's strength lay not only in its walls, but in the calculated cruelty wielded within them. To resist was to risk the rack, the scavenger's daughter, or the manacles, a fate few could endure. The psychological terror of torture was as potent as the physical. Prisoners knew what awaited them if they did not cooperate. Rumors of screams, of bodies broken in chambers below, haunted those who paced the tower cells. For many, the dread of torture was enough to break them before the instruments touched their skin. The tower's reputation as a place of torment extended far beyond its gates, seeping into London's collective imagination. To be sent there was not only to lose freedom, it was to face the threat of unspeakable agony. The cruelty was heightened by secrecy. Tortures were often carried out away from public eyes, in dungeons where stone walls muffled cries. This secrecy fueled rumors, some exaggerated, others chillingly true, that made the tower's reputation darker still. The uncertainty of what exactly happened within those walls amplified the fear. In truth, the ambiguity was deliberate. It was not only the tortured who suffered, but those who imagined what torture meant. Over time, the tower's role as a torture chamber became legend. Even after the practice faded, the stories endured. Nobles stretched on the rack, spies crushed in the scavenger's daughter, rebels left dangling in manacles. These tales outlived the victims themselves, turning the tower into a symbol not just of royal power, but of royal cruelty. Its dungeons became shorthand for tyranny, its instruments of pain remembered as warnings carved into history. Today, tourists walk through the tower and see replicas of the Rack or the Scavenger's Daughter, reminders of the horrors once inflicted there. But for those who lived through it, the tower's torture chambers were not curiosities. They were nightmares made real, places where agony was crafted with intent. The Tower of London was not only a fortress or a prison, it was a chamber of torment, where bodies were broken to preserve authority, and where screams became part of England's most chilling history. The Tower of London stones are steeped in blood. Though it was built as a fortress and palace, it became infamous as a place where lives ended violently, where execution was not only punishment but spectacle. Within and around its walls, some of the most dramatic deaths in English history played out. These were not anonymous victims. Many were queens, princes, and nobles, whose deaths shaped the course of the kingdom. The tower's stones bore witness to ambition undone, betrayal punished and power cemented in blood. One of the tower's darkest mysteries is that of the princes in the tower. In 1483, the young Edward V and his brother Richard, Duke of York, were lodged in the tower under the protection of their uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. But the boys vanished, never to be seen again. Many believe they were murdered, smothered in their sleep to clear the way for their uncle to seize the throne as Richard III. Their disappearance haunted English history. The tower itself transformed into a place where innocence had been swallowed by ambition. The story of the princes ensured that the tower would forever be linked to betrayal and blood. The tower also became the final stage for some of England's most famous queens. Anne Boleyn, the second wife of Henry VIII, was brought here in 1536 after being accused of adultery and treason. Once crowned in splendor, she ended her days within the tower, pacing its chambers awaiting the sword that would strike her down. Her execution on Tower Green was swift but shocking, a reminder that even queens were not safe from the king's wrath. Less than a decade later, another queen, Catherine Howard, Henry's fifth wife, met the same fate, her blood staining the same ground. Lady Jane Grey, the 9 Days Queen, also perished here. Crowned in the chaos following Edward VI's death, she was only 16 when she was imprisoned in the Tower by Mary. For months, she lived under the shadow of execution, until finally, in 1554, she was beheaded within its walls. Her youth and innocence made her death especially tragic, a symbol of how the Tower consumed not only rebels and traitors, but also pawns in political games larger than themselves. The Tower's role as an execution ground extended beyond its walls to Tower Hill, where many high-born prisoners met their end. Nobles, rebels, and even clergy were marched out from the fortress to the scaffold, where crowds gathered to witness their deaths. Some, like Thomas More, went to their fate with quiet defiance, their words remembered long after the axe fell. Others begged for mercy or confessed their guilt. In every case, the tower served as the backdrop, its looming walls framing the spectacle of state-sanctioned death. These executions were more than punishments. They were political statements. The monarchy used them to demonstrate power, to silence rivals, and to warn others of the consequences of disloyalty. The blood spilled on the tower's stones was not only that of the guilty, but of the inconvenient, the unlucky, or the merely suspected. Justice and survival were secondary to the crown's need to maintain control. The tower was not just a prison or fortress, it was a theater where the drama of power ended in blood. The memory of these deaths seeped into the tower's reputation. Londoners whispered of ghosts haunting its halls, Anne Boleyn carrying her severed head, the cries of Lady Jane Grey, the laughter of the lost princes. These stories turned the tower into more than a site of execution. They made it a symbol of death itself, a place where power consumed lives and left spirits behind. The blood on the stones was never fully washed away, lingering in imagination long after the bodies were buried. Today, visitors walk across Tower Green, where plaques mark the spot of beheadings, and Tower Hill, where scaffolds once stood. But to those who lived through it, the site was not historical. It was immediate and terrifying. The tower's stones were slick with real blood, its air heavy with the weight of lives cut short. The fortress stood not only as a monument to royal power, but as a graveyard for its victims. The tower's history is written not in crowns and jewels, but in the blood that stained its stones. The Tower of London has outlived kings and queens, rebellions and wars, yet its darkest legacy is not in the battles it withstood, but in the dread it inspired. For centuries, its name alone was enough to chill the blood. To be told you were sent to the tower was a sentence of terror, for the fortress was less a place of justice than a symbol of betrayal, cruelty, and death. Even as its function changed, the tower carried with it a reputation so heavy that it became part of England's cultural memory, a legacy of dread that lingers even today. This reputation began with its role as a prison for the high and mighty. Unlike ordinary jails, the tower held nobles, heirs, queens, and rebels whose fates were often decided not by law but by politics. The uncertainty of survival made it terrifying. Some entered its gates and were released, their fortunes restored. Many more left only for the scaffold. The tower became synonymous with doom, a place where the powerful were humbled and the proud brought low. In the minds of the people, its walls were haunted not only by prisoners, but by the inevitability of their fates. The cruelty that unfolded inside amplified this dread. Tales of torture, the rack, the scavenger's daughter, the manacles, spread far beyond the fortress itself. Londoners whispered of screams echoing through its dungeons, of prisoners broken in body and spirit. Whether every story was true mattered less than the fact that they were believed. The tower's legend became larger than its reality, a symbol of royal tyranny where pain was manufactured in the shadows. Its dungeons became metaphors for oppression, its walls embodiments of cruelty. Executions within and outside its grounds carved that dread into stone. Anne Boleyn, Lady Jane Grey, Thomas More, and countless others perished under its gaze, their deaths turning the tower into a stage for England's most notorious tragedies. Each execution was not only an end but a performance, witnessed by crowds who carried the memory home. These stories became part of England's identity, reminders that power was fleeting and that the tower waited for those who fell out of favor. Blood on its stones became part of its myth, retold through generations until the tower itself was inseparable from death. Even after its role as a prison waned, the tower's reputation endured. By the 18th century, it no longer held the same steady flow of traders and nobles, yet its name still carried fear. Visitors came to see the graffiti scratched by desperate prisoners, the places where queens had been beheaded, the chambers where torture had been inflicted. Guides recounted tales of ghosts, Anne Boleyn wandering headless, the princes in the tower crying in the dark, Lady Jane Grey appearing on the anniversary of her death. The tower became as much a monument to horror as to history. This legacy of dread became part of the tower's enduring power. While kings used it as a treasury and fortress, the people remembered it as a place of cruelty. Its walls bore the weight of countless stories, both recorded and imagined, each reinforcing the idea that the tower was more than stone. It was fear solidified. Even now, as tourists flock to see the crown jewels and yeoman warders in scarlet and gold, the darker side of its past lurks beneath the pageantry. Visitors pause on Tower Green, where innocence once bled, or peer into the bloody tower, where princes vanished. The past is never far away. The Tower of London's legacy is not simply one of heritage, but of horror. It represents the dangers of unchecked power, the fragility of fortune, and the cruelty that can be inflicted in the name of authority. For centuries, it stood as a warning to all who entered London's gates: obey or the tower awaits. Its dread was not only historical but psychological, shaping how people thought of justice, punishment, and monarchy itself. Today, the tower survives as both tourist attraction and cautionary tale. Its stones gleam under the sun, its jewels sparkle under guarded lights. Yet beneath this display lies a history soaked in fear. The legacy of dread it carries cannot be polished away, for it was built not only with mortar and stone, but with the suffering of those who lived and died within. To walk its grounds is to walk where innocence was betrayed, where ambition was punished, where blood stained the earth. The Tower of London may be celebrated as a national treasure, but its truest legacy is one of fear, darker than history often dares to tell.